Let's think about that phenomenon spreading throughout Europe, the Age of Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason. It's going to have profound effects here in the New World. While the Age of Enlightenment spreads throughout Europe, it also will come across the pond or the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, here to the New World in the late 17th century. Gentlemen like John Locke and Sir Isaac Newton will have a profound uh, way of challenging the old order. In fact, Newton's law of gravity and motion will describe the world in terms of natural laws beyond any spiritual force. So it's nature, it's not something in the heavens that dictates what happens here on earth. While John Locke will assert the right of a people to change a government that did not protect natural rights of life, liberty, and property. You're probably going to want to say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. No, but John Locke is life, liberty, and property. Uh, that we have the right to change the government, that if it doesn't protect these rights, it's very radical thinking. And in fact, people in this age of enlightenment, this age of reason, they're beginning to doubt the existence of a God who could predestine human beings to eternal damnation, and more in particular, empower a tyrant for a king. What type of God would make a king who's a tyrant, right? So people are starting to doubt the existence of God during this age. Political attitudes changed during this time period also. Like I mentioned, John Locke will defend the displacement of a monarch who could not protect that lives, liberties, and property of the English people. Going a little further, French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, don't worry, you don't have to spell that or remember him, but I do want you to kind of get the idea that things are changing, that society should be ruled by a general will. In fact, Baron de Montesquieu, another French gentleman, he would declare that power should not be concentrated in the hands of any one individual. So one person shouldn't control all the power. In fact, Montesquieu will recommend separating power among executive, legislative, judicial branches of government. Hopefully that sounds familiar to yourselves because that's exactly what we have here in the United States. So, French philosopher, gentleman Baron de Montesquieu will actually declare this way before you think Americans came up with this on our own. Uh, but Americans are absorbing all these ideas coming out of Europe. In fact, the writings of Benjamin Franklin made many Enlightenment ideas accessible to the general public here in the colonies. The old way of life was represented by superstition, an angry God, an absolute submission to authority, the king or the queen, wherever you may be. The thinkers of the Age of Reason will usher in a new way of thinking. This new way championed the accomplishments of humankind. Individuals did not have to accept despair. Science and reasoning could bring happiness and progress. And in particular, these political ideas start to challenge. They will kind of come up with the idea, or you'll start to see the thinking that kings did not rule by divine right. God didn't appoint them. And in fact, kings and monarchs have an obligation to their subjects. Europeans pondered the implications for nearly a century. Uh, Americans will actually put them into practice. Now, not all ministers were swept up by this age of reason. I don't want you to think that. Uh, In fact, a religious revival will sweep through the British American colonies in the 1730s. Many will rebel against this age of reasoning and this kumbaya feelings. In fact, uh, New Englanders and ministers will become very adamant that we're becoming too concerned over worldly matters. People are starting to find the pursuit of wealth to be more important than religious principles. uh, God is angry. They will state, and humans are sinners. And these ministers will give these sermons throughout the colonies, and people will come to listen. This sparked what became known as the Great Awakening in the American colonies. I do want you to remember the Great Awakening. It's this revival. God is angry, and humans are sinners, and these ministers are going out and about throughout the colonies, preaching and uh, telling of this mantra. George Whitefield, he's probably one of the most famous ministers during this Great Awakening here in the New World, in the colonies. He's actually a minister from Britain who will tour the American colonies. He's an actor by training. So he, as an actor, he learns how to speak and project so that he can speak to and people can hear him from far distances for loud, large crowds. And he would shout the word of God. He would weep with sorrow and tremble with passion as he delivered his sermons. Colonists will flock by the thousands to hear him speak. He converted slaves and even a few Native Americans. Even religious skeptic Benjamin Franklin will empty his coin purse after hearing him speak in Philadelphia. And you should have read. There's a primary source in there talking about how Benjamin Franklin uh, went to one of these sermons. And I won't go into too much detail because you should have read the source, and there may be an assessment on it. So. Uh, Soon much of America becomes divided. Either you're awakened or you're new life. Either you believe God is angry or no, God is kind, or possibly there is no God. So we see kind of a division. But despite this division, despite this conflict, we do see a greater religious toleration here in the colonies. Uh, it's also a long-term cause of the revolution, this enlightenment. And you're wondering, how can that be? Uh, Before old world thinking, ministers, preachers represented an upper class of some sort. You had to go to college or a divinity school or some sort of higher education. During this Great Awakening, we see ministers that are not always ordained, not always going to higher levels of education. It could be anybody can preach, breaking down respect for betters, breaking down those class lines of who could preach and who could not. So we start to see kind of uh, a classless, in regards to religion at least, society. And in fact, the new faiths that emerged were much more democratic in their approach. The overall message is one of greater equality. Now, this Great Awakening, and I kind of mentioned that George Whitefield goes out on tour preaching, and it was a tour. This Great Awakening of all these ministers and these preachers that are going out, and colonists are flocking by the thousands to hear them talk. I'd like you to think about it, and it sounds kind of funny here. I'd like you to think of it as like a major football game or a rock concert, right? Let's go with a rock concert, and people are going, they're getting excited about it. In fact, from some of your readings, your primary sources, talking about how they're building bigger town halls so that they can get some of the better ministers in there. So this Great Awakening is a national occurrence uh, where colonists are coming together for one particular purpose to see this. And I don't want to call it entertainment, but in a sense, it is entertainment, right? We have all these ministers going out there, and people enjoy this, and we're going to this occurrence, this preaching, this religious revival, whatever you want to call it, this great awakening together. Once again, bringing the colonies together, helping to break down differences between them. You may be in Virginia colony, but you're going to the same revival concert, right? Than the person who's a Massachusetts colonist or a South Carolina colonist. Indeed, this religious upheaval, this revival, has serious political consequences because once again, that sense of nationalism as colonists being the same, all doing the same thing. Uh, and the Great Awakening is part of that. Like I mentioned, this thinking does come over in America. Intellectuals are reading these ideas as well. In fact, enlightened ideas of liberty and progress had a chance to flourish without the shackles of old Europe. And what does that mean? That means here in the colonies, they can kind of embrace these ideas and practice them the best they can without the fear of being arrested, for one thing, without the fear of Big Brother looking over their shoulder, because Big Brother is back in Europe, back in England. Uh, in fact, this age of reason, this age of enlightenment, will have an effect on religion. Religious leaders will begin to change their old dogmatic positions. They'll start to change the way they practice religion. In fact, we'll start to see an emphasis regarding the similarities between the Anglican Church and the Puritan Congregationalists rather than the differences, right? A rationalization, a reasoning. By the end of the century, many New England ministers would become Unitarians, doubting even the divinity of Christ. Uh, on this slide, I have Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson here because there are two of the most uh, enlightened thinkers here in the colonies at this time period.